Hello and welcome everyone who's joining us now. I'm Natasha Grist from the Norwich Institute for Sustainable Development based here in the School of Global Development at UEA. We're really delighted to introduce our first Thought Leader Seminar Series speaker today for 2025, Emily Norton. She is the policy champion for the Agri-Food for Net Zero Network and also founder of Farm Foresight Limited and various other roles. Coming from a farming background, Emily is such a source of knowledge and inspiration for us, as well as a number of forthright opinions and views, which we really enjoy around farming in Norfolk and the UK. Today, she's going to talk to us about a vision for England's future food, farming and land use. Before we start the presentation, just a couple of things. This presentation is being shown live online and it will be recorded, but there's no camera showing to the audience. In an emergency, we'll be exiting from the main door at the back there, those who are here in person. And in terms of timing, it'll be a little bit less than an hour. Emily will talk for about 25 minutes and we'll have plenty of time for discussion, questions, and so on. So if you're online and joining us, please do put any comments into the chat, any questions into the Q&A. And we hope to have quite an informal discussion and chat at the end of the presentation. So I'll hand over now. Many thanks, Emily.
You are very welcome. Hello, everybody in the room and also online. It really is quite an honour to be here amongst friends as well, which is good. Good to see some familiar faces in the audience. So it's a real honour, actually. This is kind of a new talk. I do quite a lot of talks, but I've kind of pulled this together because it was a really interesting challenge from you guys here at the NISD to have this sort of long-term view. I mean, it's quite easy to do the short-term, near-term criticism of policy and understanding where things are going and what's going on within sort of a current affairs perspective for farming and for land use, but sort of really kind of projecting forwards. This is the bit where I've sort of challenged myself to be, I suppose, a bit more advocating or kind of like, you know, really kind of what could we wish could be happening in this space. So the photo is my own farm, and it would be probably about 40 years ago. And I put it up there because it gives that interesting perspective of timescales of how things have changed. You know, we're talking now 2025, we're getting 25 years into the future, but sort of that generation ago, you know, things still looked actually relatively familiar. Yes, the machinery has got substantially larger and the process a lot quicker. And interestingly, this particular farm is no longer being cropped. It's entirely managed for environmental outputs at the moment, apart from more or less where the photo's been taken from, which is now a vineyard, a classic climate adaptation play. So, you know, just an interesting perspective on how things are changing and what we're thinking about. This needs to be over here so I can click forwards. Hang on a minute, let me try again. So in terms of the agenda, let me just see if I can get this up for you all. There you go. An introduction to me, because as much as some people here know me, a lot of you will have no idea who on earth I am, what I've done. We'll then look at those current trends, the vision, and then also some enabling factors that I would like to see kind of happen in order to kind of get us to where we need to go. And there will be plenty of time at the end for Q&A, and somebody's going to wave at me if I go on too long, so that's all fine. Right, start at the beginning. Me. That's me with my first ever egg, which is very exciting. So I was born into farming. I was lucky enough to be born into farming, but I had a younger brother. And so he was 6 years younger than I am. So when he still is 6 years younger than I am, when I was thinking about what I was going to do with my life, farming wasn't really an option. So I went off and I did law because my mother told me I was good at arguing. And that's a good enough reason to do a degree. It was free then. It made it an easier sort of decision, didn't it? Right? University education was free. But I trained as a lawyer and I went to London and I qualified and I hated it. And I knew that that wasn't my pathway. So I went back into sustainable agriculture. That's me getting some prize or the other from Harper Adams when I did my master's in sustainable agriculture. But what that allowed me to do, amongst getting back to kind of what I was really passionate about, which was always farming and food systems, was a business plan for our family business, which the cousins are still running, which is absolutely fantastic. And I then spent 12 years working within that mixed family farming system. So quite a crowded little farm, lots of family members, very busy, lots of stuff going on. But it really kind of was that founding for me in kind of how decisions were being made in that context. And we might come back to this, the sort of irritatingly strong role that tax plays in deciding on farming outcomes, land management outcomes. More recently than this, I've been doing some stuff probably since 2014 was when I really took a change in direction. I took a job in policy working for a member of the European Parliament when we had members of the European Parliament here. And he was very interested in working on what an independent agricultural policy would look like outside of the UK. I wasn't particularly for leave, but I did think the question was intellectually interesting. What would we do with a blank piece of paper? How would we make things better? So 2016, with the referendum, arguably we were too successful at persuading farmers that there was this sort of silver lining of environmental and agricultural policy outside of the EU system that we could begin to innovate and do better. But I could begin to see, from my perspective, the integration of things that were really important and how they weren't working to be integrated within the European framework, and particularly, food, the environment, water, and really bringing it back down to health. And we've kind of come to this where we really need to see these things integrated together. 2018, I took the opportunity to do a Nuffield Scholarship. Would strongly recommend everybody who's interested in this space to think about a Nuffield Scholarship. I wanted to look at global best practice in agricultural policy design. It was definitely a post-Brexit thing, where around the world we're doing agricultural policy really, really well from that independent perspective. And people would say to me, I should go to New Zealand. They do things really interestingly. They got rid of all of their subsidies, or go to the States. They have amazing kind of insurance-based policies. And I pushed back on all of that. I wanted to go and look at small crowded islands with complicated food security relationships with their nearest neighbours, because I felt that was much more similar to how we were going to be in the UK with our dependencies upon the EU. And so I went to places like Cuba, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and also the Isle of Man, which was always outside of the European Union. So these island economies, the photos there, the top one was a sweet corn festival in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong at that time was still running an independent agricultural research station in order to try and protect some kind of national identity against kind of the Chinese sort of transition to sort of purely Chinese control of Hong Kong. So a particularly interesting time to be understanding what agricultural policy meant for them and their territorial identity. And then the second one, the bottom one, was Cuba, which still relies heavily on I wasn't there when the plough was being used, but there were oxen regularly being used. My favourite photo from Cuba was not this one. It's got a cruise liner in the background on those amazing American vintage cars at the front, somebody with a horse and cart across the middle. That real kind of amazing juxtaposition of all of these different technologies going on, but a highly independent policy in a highly constrained environment. It's absolutely fascinating to go and see. The reason I did the Nuffield was to get into my next role. My next role was working for Savills, the international property consultancy. I headed up their rural research department for 5 years and did some really interesting things around things like the Rock Review. I was on their panel, which was all about how the changes in the English land management, the environmental land management schemes were not really taking the needs of the tenant farmer into consideration. So it was talking lots about a long-term land use change, which was really negatively impacting on tenants. It was really interesting to get involved in some of that kind of stuff. And then at the same time I was doing all of that, chair of the Oxford Farming Conference. And then in 2023, in order to try and de-stress from all of that crazy stuff that was going on, I dropped out of my corporate career and came back to farming, which didn't kind of last very long in terms of managing craziness, because I now do various different jobs across the rural space. The main one I suppose I'm doing at the moment is as policy champion for the Agri-Food for Net Zero Network, led by Professor Neil Ward. He's one of the co-leads on that particular project, looking at the research that's needed, the knowledge gaps that are needed to transition the entire UK agri-food system to net zero. So it's absolutely vast. It's a topic question, but from a policy perspective, it's really interesting because we're beginning to ask and really challenge ourselves questions around how we're engaging people, where are the policy opportunities leaning into this space, and what we're going to do to get there. And then I do a couple of sort of non-executive positions, one for the Environmental Markets Board, which is looking at nutrient offsetting markets and sort of where private finance is coming into land management options, and another one with Soil Association Exchange, which is very much focused on kind of an insetting type model and looking at agri-food supply systems and how we can do more in that space. So I mentioned all of that just to kind of, blended experience, quite a lot going on, but still very, very interested in, and that's, it's my vineyard, baby vineyard. So 3 major trends. Right, so 3 big things that I think are really going on at the moment that I think influence kind of like where we are thinking about how the future is going to pan out and prove, I think, these kind of like blockers in some ways, but also things that we need to be aware of in terms of this bigger direction of travel. So the first one is net zero and the fund that is net zero. So as we know, Labour have really doubled down on this against maybe a global, slightly Trumpian approach, which is rejecting perhaps some of this thinking. And we also see political fault lines forming around net zero as an issue. I think the far right wing and Reform really see that there's a political division to be pulled over net zero. So we can't take it for granted. And actually, there is a bit within farming as well, for some pretty valid reasons, who have pushed back quite hard against net zero in its own right. But Labour are doubling down on it. But I think part of that is because it's sort of become synonymous with energy security. And so kind of thinking about net zero for them is really about how we are onshoring our domestic production in renewable energy, for example. And so when they're talking about the net zero mission, they're sort of thinking about mostly energy security. Well, that has a consequence for land and for land use and for land take. But sort of pushing agriculture and farming and land use systems through a net zero lens does produce some real challenges because of the things like the focus on livestock numbers and the focus on sort of current thinking within kind of yield-based production systems. So we've seen some very interesting things happening recently on this in terms of pushback on technological solutions and the whole Bovaer scandal that happened, which is a methane additive, and the way that it was possibly a little bit consumers pushing back on this, but it was also this sort of like conspiracy theory type approach of kind of being doubtful of technological solutions into this space. But there's some bigger things going on here that I think we really need to be aware of. One is that if we don't measure these things, we can't manage them. And it's relatively easy to measure the impact of fairly intensive livestock systems. So when animals are housed, it's much easier to measure what impact they're having. It's much harder to measure it if they're outside grazing, right? And if they're in a more natural system, to actually measure how much methane it's producing, for example, is much harder. So pushing back on technological solutions without necessarily having the evidence of what's better puts us into quite a tricky position. We can't kind of argue emotively that these things are better. We need to have the evidence that whatever we are advocating for is objectively better, rather than just kind of this idea that, we don't like it and we're going to put our pole in the ground and complain about it. And the reason for this, the main reason for this, is because this is partly being driven by government, and government pushing an agenda because it perceives there to be bigger picture security reasons around it. It's partly driven because we are so exposed to corporate supply chains. And it's those corporate supply chains that are really driving these behaviours in this space. And gut feeling is simply not good enough for that, right? They need data, they need information. And there are countries, even within the EU, who are really leading on this. And there's big stuff on Denmark just before Christmas, right, who've implemented, for both water quality and climate reasons, a carbon tax, so to kind of limit the way that their livestock systems are working. So it is possible to do it. It's possible to kind of push farming systems through these new lenses of accountability, but we really need to do way more engagement with this, with the farming and also with consumers to understand what impact this is going to have. The challenge being, of course, that this is not about only meeting net zero. I was listening to a podcast with the head of sustainability at Nestle, I think, and she was very worried that we would kind of hit the target but miss the point. And I thought that was a really powerful way of kind of like trying to put in perspective what this means, because within food and farming systems, like net zero is not really synonymous with something positive in the way that it's synonymous with kind of renewables from an energy perspective. We haven't got that parallel for farming systems of the beneficial thing that we're really thinking about. Yes, it's about reducing impact, but I think, as we'll kind of keep coming back to, it's that positive vision of what we mean when we say and how we use this lever to drive those changes. But supply chains are really, really on board with wanting this to happen. They need this information. They need it for their disclosures. We're really pushing in that direction. Okay, the second one is environmental policy. Sort of thinking about these things really came from my Nuffield. When I was traveling around the world, you kind of think that it's just all about the amount of money that you've got to put into farming. And, you know, you think of a number, how many billions it is, and kind of like, how do you distribute it to your population of farmers in order to kind of keep them viable? But actually it really isn't. And if you look at all of the different countries around the world and how they are supporting agriculture, you have to set some pretty big macro level things first. And in particular, your first one would be trade, your attitude to free trade. And you can create some fairly sticky barriers to importing food in and out of a country. Australia are famously good at this. You know, they don't really like food imports into Australia at all, right? So it's all about exports for them and kind of making exports as easy as possible. And the Swiss are the same. The Swiss even price in their trading system as a value at the farm gate, right? So first of all, you need to set that approach to trade. The second one, as I kind of mentioned in relation to Hong Kong, you need to kind of understand your food policy and what you want to be feeding people and how that then links into domestic procurement. We're getting a bit more of an idea of that. This third one is the environmental policy and this environmental baseline. And particularly for the UK, like, you know, trade, we're all about trade. We get trade, and trade was one of the big reasons and justifications for Brexit, right? We wanted an independent trading policy. But the environmental bit and the food bit, and I'll come to food in a minute, these are kind of relatively new areas for us. We don't really know what our kind of inherent ideological approach to environmental policy is. We've had something out of the EU, but actually what we believe tends to be way more wrapped up in beauty and heritage and much less about environmental protection, which is why we've still got this absolutely appalling approach to water quality in this country where planning controls don't control how land is used, it controls how land is developed. So, we're not restricting how farmers can use their fields at the moment in order to kind of underpin environmental policy. If we were going to have a coherent environmental policy, it would cover all land and it would set a coherent baseline that says, for example, thou shalt not pollute. But it doesn't say that at the moment, right? This would be very piecemeal. I think they're beginning to realise quite where this is kind of coming from, because we've got all of these targets now baked into the Environment Act, which is then manifesting, EIP stands for Environmental Improvement Plan, my apologies. Steve Reed, the current Secretary of State, announced a rapid review of those last year, because at the moment we've got all of these targets and we've got all of this spend and the two don't match up. We basically created the Agriculture Act to kind of say we're going to spend money on all of these things, but then only afterwards created the Environment Act. The Climate Change Act was there underneath as well. None of it links up, none of it's coherent in terms of how those pieces of policy, how the money is achieving the targets. And it's a real risk. It's worse for things like water than it is perhaps soil management, because, the evidence of kind of the policy objective, we want all soils to be in sustainable management. There's a sustainable soil management option under the sustainable farming incentive that will link to this particular target. But things like water, as I mentioned, are real weak points. We don't have the data, we don't have the link between the positive outcomes, and it's really bad for climate. We're really lacking the data and the information between what farmers are being paid to do, particularly for environmental land management outcomes, and then what impact that then has on climate related issues. So I think one of the consequences of all of this kind of like muddled confusion of really urgent. We want to get it some legislation out the door, and it's going to be the Brexit bonus. And here you go, here's all the legislation. Is now going, Christ, spending review, money's tight. How is the money that we've got really matching against these targets and these goals that we've set ourselves? And at the moment, it really isn't, which is why we've got these rapid reviews going on. So I think this is going to come back to three key things, three major impacts. It's ridiculous that we're not going to get a baseline in England of where we're at. We've got some patchwork data, but it's really gappy. I think if we're going to do this seriously, we need to be thinking about baselining so that we know that the money is being justified and it's producing an outcome. We're going to have to get way more used to providing data and information and evidence. So we're measuring the outcomes of these things again, so we can justify the policy spend. And then I think we are also going to have to expect a major reform of what we are being paid and regulated to do. So some of the things that are coming out of the environmental improvement plan review processes are highlighting, for example, that the only tool, there's a risk that the only tool to kind of get the outcomes on farmed land is this environmental land management schemes. There are no other policy levers there at the moment. And so, it's a risk. You've got one and it's optional whether farmers take it up. And that's not going to achieve the progress that government wants it to achieve. And so it's just this huge red flag in my mind that there's this massive gap for regulation in that space. And if we're not taking it up and we're not providing the evidence of progress, like it does kind of like leave open this policy risk to me. So the water thing's not going to go away. I can only imagine that's going to get tougher. Steve Reed was kind of elected on doing something about water, doing something about the water companies. Once he's done something about the water companies, everybody's going to realise that the majority of diffuse pollution is still coming from farmed land. We're going to get more of a focus, kind of like Sauron's gaze back onto farming. What are we going to do about it at that point? Should we be ready for it? I mean, arguably, yes. So there's interesting stuff here, though. In the sense that I don't see that Labour are really changing a great deal from the pattern that was laid out by the previous administration, which was a pretty right-wing administration, in thinking that this sort of like creative destructionist approach to growth and innovation that we've got going on at the moment, right? So businesses who don't get this just go bust. There's no safety net. There's no working from the bottom up. I think what Scotland and Wales are doing in this space is way more culturally aware and much more sympathetic to a farming audience. I think what we're getting at the moment is still this approach that things are going to get tougher, money's going to get tighter, but good businesses will innovate and bad businesses will fail. And that's the kind of like the harsh summary, but I don't see really evidence from this government, meaningful evidence from this government that it's taking any different approach to really what we saw laid out in the previous administration. But look, there is some good stuff happening. I really like the mission-led approach. I like the land use framework. I think it's asking some really interesting questions about how government can be more strategic. What's the appropriate role of government? Not to bail out businesses, but to kind of like do the strategic long-term planning that we all kind of wish that government was doing into this space. And so I see a lot of positivity in there. Like it puts the amount of land use change we need into perspective. It's talking, just 0.2% of land is going to be needed for housing and all the housing targets, but 9% is needed for climate mitigation and into environment. So, complete land use change, right? And it is asking some really interesting questions. And the technical annex, for a technical annex, it's not very long and it's really interesting. So I would commend it to you all. It's the scale of change that's needed are good, and the principles within it, multifunctional land use, like these things that we know should be absolutely obvious. What we're changing to make sure that they're delivering against lots of things rather than just one thing, and decisions fit for the long term. It's going to be one of their core principles around land use planning. There's some really good things in there if they become real. If it's just another piece of paper, and then it's nothing, right? We need these things to become more meaningful. And we'll come on to the vision bit in a minute. One of the things that kind of upsets me about the land use framework at the moment is it talks only about land use change. So it's talking about whatever's there at the moment and how it changes. It doesn't then talk about what that land then becomes and how that land is then used necessarily. And so at the moment, we've only got really food as kind of the primary driver, the primary economic output that's priced into land. We're trying to create other ones. We're doing interesting stuff with biodiversity net gain, for example, and trying to create alternative income streams through carbon markets as well. But they only really focus on the change. So biodiversity net gain, you do your 5 years of, you do your uplift, you sell your credits within, say, 5 years of project inception. You then have to maintain it for 25, 30 years after that at somebody's cost. You're not necessarily getting an income every year unless you structure the deal in that particular way. And I think that's a real issue. I think we need to be thinking about the economic viability of all land. And the more we can price in those public benefits into consistent long-term income streams, not capital disposal type issues, the more we're going to create a really dynamic marketplace for land use outcomes, where the market in theory should be telling us what optimum outcomes, water storage, carbon storage, flood mitigation, whatever it might be, goes in which particular place. We've got a really imperfect market signal there. Now, government said it wants to be more strategic. Land use framework might give it the tools to be more strategic, but we still need to be thinking about pricing in rural vibrancy and, the economic well-being of the rural places in the countryside. Land abandonment will achieve some of their goals, but not in an economically relevant way. So within all of that, my key takeaway is that food is the ultimate nature-based solution, right? When you think about all of the things that the land provides for us, food is the most important one, really. We can say energy, we can say housing, we can say water, whatever, but the primary dominant land use is still thinking about food supply chains. But those food supply chains are desperate to evolve too. So kind of the more that we can work with those existing relationships, those existing dependencies, those existing kind of power structures and payment structures to say, how are we evolving new expectations and multifunctional land use within those spaces, I think the better we'll become. So it's really easily overlooked when government is only thinking about designing a really complicated agri-environmental scheme. But those are the powerful actors within the system. We need to think about that. Okay, third one, food security. Food security is national security. I have got so much I could say about this. Basically, my biggest concern about this is farmers kind of are arguing that we do it for love, not money. But if we're doing it for love, not money, why should we be paid any more than we are at the moment, which is not very much. And so we're kind of trapped in this kind of moral poverty where, it just doesn't make any sense to me. We need to kind of break out of this mindset that somehow we are being the heroes because we work harder than everybody else for longer hours and less pay. And that somehow kind of, makes it a special case that's worth protecting. And I think as much as I have enormous sympathy for people who are in that kind of way of thinking, I don't think that there's going to be a bailout for that. I think we need to get much smarter about working out what our market wants to pay us for, who our customers are. And I think, like I said earlier, this government isn't there to kind of save everybody. This government is to say that the good businesses will innovate and bad businesses fail, and that's capitalism. So I think we just maybe need to be a bit more aware about kind of what some of this messaging is. And when we see these messages, no farmers, no food, somebody's going to be paid to produce food. So we need to work out who's going to get paid to produce food and whether it's going to be an industry in this country. It absolutely has to be. We've got some brilliantly productive land. We've got brilliantly talented farmers. There's such positivity and so much talent and an enormously good research base. Can not mention that in this kind of facility. We've got all of the right kind of criteria, apart from maybe the mindset that says we can do this. So I think that's really difficult to change. But Labour have just done this new food security review. They seem to be kind of thinking into this space of food as health and farmers being able to kind of rebuild that link and thinking about procurement and thinking about supplying into the public sector. But it's not just food security. It is energy security. It is water security. It is nature security. And so when we think about this single lens, we miss the point again. And really needing to kind of continuously evolve towards something that's much more blended and therefore gives us much more security because we're not just dependent on one thing. Doing more with less is really key. And this question of what's the vision for this post-productivist era, I say it's a post-productivist era, partly to keep Neil Ward happy, who likes talking about, the end of productivism and this single metric of it's about yield, right? It's not now just about yield. It has to be about loads of things, but it's really complicated to kind of work out what that's going to be. So my vision for 2050, I think if I wish for anything above anything else, I took this photo, I think it was in Asda locally or something. I mean, it's a single government department for health and wellbeing. So at the moment, we have this particularly curious situation where the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs is kind of making decisions mostly about the environment. And all of these environmental act targets that we've kind of, talked about, they are driving land use decision making, and they are kind of now directing where the money is going to be going to. And then on the other hand, we've got the Department for Enterprise and Net Zero, who are kind of driving how business and industry is kind of thinking about net zero strategies and climate adaptation, talking about how land use needs to change and adapt, talking about how energy fits together. We've also got the Department for Health, who's thinking about kind of increasingly preventative strategies for how we keep people happy and healthy and well fed. This is so unbelievably centrally critical to land and land use resources and how we use land use planning. We cannot continue to think about these in completely different departments. Now, even within a single department, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And yet the entire fabric and future of our health and wellbeing is currently being fought over because Treasury is not fit for purpose and is not structured to invest in these things in a coherent way. Okay, these departments are competing against each other, nothing about them. We're listening to amazing talks at the Norfolk Farming Conference on Tuesday, talk about how important it is for cooperation and collaboration in order to achieve some of these outcomes. And yet the fundamental institution of government is not fit for purpose on this, in my opinion. So if I'm calling a revolution against anything, it's a revolution against the current architecture of government and how it's set up to achieve these things for us. So it's not a small ask to think that by 2050, we've got a single department that is making coherent decisions in the national best interest. It would be enforcing a right to food so that everybody is it's considered how nutritional adequacy is relevant for every single person in this country, and then how we are producing and procuring that food and to what standard. It's thinking about the integration of environment and climate goals because there are trade-offs. There have to be trade-offs in how we use the limited resources that we've got available to us. So unless we have coherent governance systems that understands and talks about and has the evidence for those trade-offs, we're never going to get anywhere. It's seeking to achieve a healthy and resilient economy. Maybe growth within that, but like growth at any sake, growth at any cost, I still think is kind of the mantra that we've got. And then founded on regenerative economics, because, it's well overdue that people mattered in thinking about economic principles, but also because obviously the current model is broken. So we really need to be thinking about what's next. Politics as if people mattered and people as part of nature. It's absolutely critical that we really begin to kind of build systems that make sense. So that's all really aspirational, right? It's all cool. Woo! I hope you took a photo. Slides are available. 3 things we need to do to get there, and conscious of time, I will do these relatively quickly. First, reform the definition of agriculture. The definition of agriculture is set out in Section 1 of the Agriculture Act 1947. We got an Agriculture Act in 2020, but it didn't touch the definition. It's an inclusive definition by which it says agriculture includes, and then it lists a whole list of stuff, right? So the definition of agriculture is essentially invisible. It's what we imagine it to be. The problem is that in that act, good agricultural husbandry went with good estate management. The two were symbiotic. Okay, so you had to keep the land in good heart so that you could have sustainable agricultural activity on top of it. It got separated sometime around the productivist era, when we just focused on good agricultural husbandry and this yield-focused approach to what we were doing. It's a problem because that definition of agriculture and its interpretation in case law drives things like tax reliefs, tenure decisions, and planning rules. A lot of the stuff that influences how we use the land is kind of derived from a 1980s vision of agriculture. So Agricultural Holdings Act tenants cannot diversify their businesses away from an ancient version of a definition of agriculture. Okay, and it's kind of barbaric. You can't even update it to sort of have better hedges, wider hedges, because the definition of a hedge is this kind of like bashed to pieces version of what was common in the 1980s. We've got to evolve, Okay, there's two ways we can evolve. The ROC review, that, as I mentioned earlier, they recommend us sending the definition to the Law Commission because it's in so many parts of legislation to work it out. But actually, because it is this imagined idea, I think we could also probably test it through case law and at some point really push some, a test case to say that the definition of good agricultural husbandry needs to be updated to something that's fit for purpose and current and bakes in all of those environmental considerations we know to be true. And through doing so, I mean, I would love it if this drove a revolution in food culture. I say that because one of the problems at the moment is that if you let land to one user and they can use it for agriculture, but it sort of restricts like what you could do if you had lots of different businesses all layered on top of each other, or a kind of community supported agriculture approach where you don't have a single tenant. It kind of opens up the opportunity to a much more flexible structure if you're dealing with some of the restrictions around tenure that we've sort of put in place here. So getting more people involved in thinking about food and farming really needs to be the objective of this. The second one, I'm sorry, this is quite small, fund a universal advisory service for farmers. We had this enormous transformation in how farming happened from the Second World War through to, say, the 1980s, 1990s. And there were two main reasons why that was achieved. The first was because there was this alignment of industry, government, technology and farming. They all wanted to achieve the same thing. They got the vision, they got the goal. But the thing that government did was have a publicly funded outreach service so every single farmer had access to the best science, the best knowledge, the best technology available so they could adapt their farming systems to meet. We have a similar challenge now. The 2050 agri-food transformation is of a similar scale of challenge as before in terms of reaching net zero, baking in these environmental targets, reaching food security, doing all of the land use change. This huge scale in mindset shift that we need. We've got industry. Industry wants this to happen, by which I mean the agri-food industry. They know that these changes need to take place. Government wants this to happen because it's got all of these targets. We've got the technology increasing, we've got the data, there might be some gaps where we know it. We haven't got the industry, the farming industry really behind this yet for two reasons. One, I think, is partly that nailing that vision, really nailing down kind of, before yield, we've got to feed everybody now, we've got to feed everybody, but subject to quite a lot of other things. And I think farm specific advice. I kind of push back a bit on government saying, this is up to you to make sense of this. I think unless we've got really good outreach and dissemination services, we don't engage with the farmers and the people in the community who really need help and can adapt, but for various reasons haven't had to. Okay, so I think, I advocate for this. And the third, which is possibly the most controversial, would be regulating land ownership. Mark Carney talked about private property rights being a solution to the intergenerational commons problem highlighted by climate change. I think that farmers at the moment, landowners at the moment, nobody's really talking about this. There's some advocates in the United States who have very much inspired me on this kind of thinking, people like Sarah K. Mock. If you own land, if you own property, land is property, right? If you own property, you've got the right to charge rent, you've got the right to public subsidy, you've got the right to tax release still, right? They've been twisted a bit, but you've still got the right to tax release. And now you've probably got the right to be paid to secure our species survival, because the more we develop these nature-based solutions markets, the more farmers get the right to be paid to carbon storage. None of it's talking about responsibilities. It's all rights. And I think that kind of drags us back to a place where property is power, and that power is a responsibility that shouldn't be taken lightly. So the image is what ChatGPT came up with when I asked it to design an EPC for land. Now, if anybody's fortunate enough to be a property owner and rent property, or if you actually just are a tenant and you rent property, you should get an EPC with it that says its energy performance potential, how much it costs you. And this will also kind of set an access to kind of being able to rent and make money from that property, right? We don't do this for land, but I think we should do. We should be baselining land. We should be benchmarking it and using that information to work out what its potential should be. The system that I work with Soil Association Exchange doesn't go this far, but it is kind of holistic benchmarking across 6 different categories. I mean, go figure ChatGPT, it can't spell very well. But I mean, like, it's an image of potential and of kind of engaging with land. The issue is, fundamentally, we don't price this stuff into the economics of land use at the moment, and we need to. The thing about EPCs for property is that they create an investment case for renovation, and it tells you when the property is below standard. We don't have a standard for land that says what good looks like or what good could be. So this is my kind of something that would allow pricing decisions, pricing signals to begin to drive investment cases for different outcomes from the land, and begin to say, what's it good at? What could it do more of? This is the thing I kind of worry about, saying I might get shot first for suggesting this. Okay, conclusion with things to watch out for. It's getting messy. Farming post-European Union is only really now beginning to find its political voice. Okay. And some of the fault lines that have been opened up are being seized on as political issues. So inheritance tax is one obvious one, what Labour have done versus what the Conservative Party have said they were going to do. Net zero is one that, say, reform is really picking fault lines on between perhaps where the Conservative Party and the Labour Party sit and where they kind of sit. So we're kind of leaning into this really messy space, and politics is therefore being dragged even righter than it has been before. Labour have sort of talked about having appetite for a more interventionist, strategic, state-led approach. But if you look at what's happening to land use in Scotland and Wales in comparison, it is way more interventionist, it's way more farmer-focused. And like I said, we're just not in that situation. But against all of that, we've obviously got this extraordinary global disruption from Trump that will just kind of like fracture and break and regurgitate and kind of like mess up kind of, these nice safe processes that we've got. And so what do we do in response to that? I kind of, when I challenge myself on it and kind of end up feeling a bit fried by the global awkwardness of everything, I think the only thing I can do is think about my own farm and make sure that my own farm is true to my own values or my own space and my own community. And I'm not doing enough of that yet. So I would like to encourage all of you that, we rebuild trust. And it is trust, I think, that it's the big thing that we need to focus on. We rebuild trust through connectivity and through communication and through working together. And so it's really important that we all continue to amplify the inclusive and progressive voices, and hope that governments, the agri-food industry and science will hold their nerve on this transition so we can really kind of leverage it to kind of drive the outcomes that we want to achieve.
Ideas and some visionary thoughts about what we can do with this in terms of the changes that might be needed. So, we know that there's a process ongoing at the moment. There's a food strategy that is being developed. There's a farming strategy. There's a land use consultation, which is ongoing. So there are real opportunities for inputting evidence, for being part of that policy space, part of that discussion space that we haven't had it at all at the same time for a number of years, since I can remember. So I do think that there's an opportunity now for all of us, whether that's as researchers or as policy engagement, influencers, whatever, to get involved with this process together and think through what those aspects and those possibilities might be. So we probably have some questions. Yep, so Hannah and then Peter in the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
You could say who you are.
Yes, I'm Johanna Porter. I work there, but I'm also an associate provost chancellor for Stewart at UVA. And thank you so much for that amazing talk. It really packed so much in. I have a question about devolution. I'm interested to hear your opinion regarding that. So obviously we heard last week, I think it was, that we're going to get some sort of combined authority from Norton and Suffolk, and what you see as being potential, I guess, opportunities for agriculture, food security, possibly challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a brilliant question. It's a direction of travel, and I think it's also really the meaningful opportunity. When I was in Canada with Nuffield, every local authority there had to have a regional agricultural management plan, which was basically the coherent strategy that said spatial planning, local land use planning, where are we prioritising for growth, where are we prioritising for nature, where are we prioritising for food production and agriculture. And because that was done at local level, you begin to kind of get those kind of coherent pictures of activity. If these things are all dealt with at different levels of government, then you're never going to get like the right level of joined up approach. And I think the biggest single untapped source of devolution power that we could get is if kind of our local NHS trusts had more responsibility for kind of DWP spend on health and wellbeing, and then equally how you could then kind of link that through to local food procurement as well. So if they were able to invest in local wellbeing, they could do something about their local spend, but we just don't have that kind of circularity yet. So could devolution bring that on? Yes. Is it likely to in the short term? I don't know. Yeah, it's just find out who our next mayor is going to be and then have a word with them. But it's about trust, isn't it? It's about government letting go and saying actually these decisions can be made better at local level. So yeah, it's a massive part of this. I mean,
thank you. This is a question from Mar Mestre from the Institute of Development Studies about the DEFRA's new food strategy. Yeah. And she asks, what can and should this new strategy, what role can it play in solving these challenges, and what should their priorities be to ensure healthy and sustainable diets?
Yeah, loads, right? So having indicators for what healthy and sustainable diets look like would be the big one. So the like food and food availability as a it has just been an economic thing, right? It's a price thing. Like, can you afford to eat? As opposed to, are you getting a nutritionally adequate diet? And there's some amazing statistics around how much like fresh produce we'd need if we were going to eat 5 a day, and actually where we're getting that from at the moment. So kind of really coherently thinking through resource availability, what people need to eat, and then how that's culturally appropriate, how people are still, are we, I just can't imagine we're going to go back to a situation where everybody is empowered to be growing their own, because, we're still going to have specialization of skills, right? There's still going to be people who are better off spending their whole day being lawyers or something, and other people who are better off spending their whole day being farmers, right? So we still need to have trade in skills. And so how are people being enabled to access this stuff? But the key thing in my mind is those better indicators of what food security actually means. And it's not just about affordability. We've got to move past price being that issue.
Next question is from Mark Thomas from the Farming Community Network. Can policy continue to cater for small holdings all the way through large commercial farms, or are we going to see an acceleration of consolidation? Will all farms be industrial by 2050?
Oh, it's such an important question, because there's two ways I can answer this. What to say? I think that like the kind of the social argument there is that we should be protecting small farmers because they're small farmers. And I don't think we've done enough to make that case with government. I think we rely on we rely too much on the narrative of tragedy in that space. And we need to get much better at kind of speaking Treasury into that particular argument. And I don't know yet what that argument is. I think it's something to do with the fact that family businesses are way more adaptable and can flex to different economic pressures. And when you've got kind of market risk and climate risk as a family unit, you can be more resilient because you can take a secondary source of income, or you can diversify, or you can take a lovely holiday, or you can not go on holiday. Like your resources can flex more than a corporate can. So a corporate has to pay wages as its primary kind of draw. So it has a cash flow problem all of the time. So I don't see that it's inevitably corporate, but I think that kind of fearing the corporate is also wrong. Some of the best farm businesses in this country who are profitable are run by corporates or institutions. And so like how we can get some of their mindsets into family farm businesses may be the right question, but I don't think that this is the end of the family farm business at all. But then the smaller end, the smallholder, of course we'll have smallholders because people will be able to kind of afford their nice house with a big garden, right? And when I look at my agri-environment scheme on my 150 acres, I sometimes think it's a nice house with a big garden because we're not really producing a lot else, right? So how is that socially accountable? I'm not sure. But the big thing, I think, will be more of a shift back to including as many people as possible in growing their own food for lots of different reasons. And so this kind of peri-urban delivery, the smallholder CSA type model, I think that really needs to be part of a future strategy. So it's much more blended, it's much more multifunctional. Where can we get more and more food back into urban and peri-urban spaces? And I was laughing about this with somebody about the use of solar panels in the countryside and like going, why don't we put solar panels on buildings? And they were like, because it's cheaper to put them in the countryside. So like all of the rest of our time is spent persuading people to grow food in buildings. So like, we put all of the food in buildings because it's more efficient, and we put the solar panels in the countryside. And I just think something is going wrong at the moment. We're just not really thinking things through clearly. So like the more diversity, the more multifunctionality, the more blended and stacked these opportunities can become, the better we get to, I think. Yeah, long answer, short question. There you go. Yeah. Good question though, Mark. I totally appreciate the reason for asking that question.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was such a fascinating talk. And just listening to you, I was thinking that, you started off with the agri-food net zero and talking about systems and food systems and so on. And of course, the minute you talk about a system and try to bridge right from the farmer and the production to who's eating and what are they consuming, then you're sort of got so many stakeholders and the space becomes very messy, as you rightly pointed out. And while you did say that your vision is that, we should have a ministry which is all joined up with climate and environment and food and health, and I could think of other things as well, like extension and education, and many other things should be rolled into that. But in a sense, I think given that you have been engaging with policy, do you think that, there's a reluctance or a resistance, or it's just the complexity of this kind of approach that puts policymakers off, and it's much easier to take a small bit and chew it off, no? That, okay, I'm doing something around supermarkets, or I'm doing something around grains or legumes or greens or whatever it is. It somehow seems to be like you can achieve something and you can measure it. Yeah. So you advocated for that. And I was just thinking that, what are your thoughts really in terms of actually measuring some of this complexity?
Yeah, yes, this is aspirational. It's kind of wish list. It's grounded in the reality of inertia and people who don't like change, right? And I'm just old enough to remember when the Ministry for Agriculture, Fisheries and Food became the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And there was uproar from the farming community because farming was no longer in the name, right? And so sort of this, and again, so, some of this sort of political noise this week that farming isn't a priority. I think we need to do a much better job of kind of like evolving the definition of farming to something that's delivering on lots of levels, not just one level. But that's a mindset shift. It's sort of a narrative shift, but it's a mindset shift to say we can embrace change and we are important, not because our perceived job title is in the departmental name, but because we are central to the foundational economy, and the foundational economy is invested in seriously, whether that's care or health or food production, right? So that's a fundamental shift, but it's not so far removed from kind of a mission-led government that's saying, we've got systemic problems, so how do we create kind of systemic solutions within a fractured departmental government siloed approach? And I'm just like going, well, let's just mash it up a bit more, because, if I was in charge, I think young people vote for benign dictators. I would go, if I was benign dictator for a day, that was my one thing I would do. Put all of those people in a room and say, you need to sort this out between you and stop arguing. Yeah. Anyway.
That note of benign dictators. I hope I'm benign, but I am going to dictate. We need to leave the room, unfortunately, now because we have another lecture coming in. Just remains for me to say thank you so much, Emily. We've really, really enjoyed you being here, and I'm sure people online are very glad to hear your presentation. Do please contact Emily or myself if you want to follow up on any of those issues. We're hoping to start developing some evidence base around some of this work around sustainable farming in East Anglia and the UK. So, do contact us if you're interested in supporting some of that. And thank you very much to Emily again.